as I share tonight with you from my heart, the stories that have really informed my practice and my healing work, I hope that you all hear your own heart speaking as well. And pay attention to those messages that you're hearing from your own heart as I'm speaking, because that's the real message that you all came here for today, to hear about stillness. Another thing that we'll just start off by saying when we're thinking about stillness is that it's not something we have to go somewhere and find, but stillness is really something we already have within us. It's just something that sometimes we need to discover and to take the time to really quiet the things outside of us and around us in our lives to really find that settled sense of stillness within. So I hope that the next hour, wherever you are, wherever you're joining us from tonight, that this is just a little moment of stillness that we can experience together, wherever we all are together. So to start off, I just want to share with you a story about the cellist of Sarajevo. Now, this is a story that I heard, and it has really inspired me over the years, about a man who in 1992 went into the center square of Sarajevo, and he plunked down a plastic chair and a cello case. And he took out his cello case. He took out his cello out of the case, and he started to play. And as he sat down in the chair and started to play his cello, and the mellow sounds of the instrument were filling the square behind him, what happened was, in the backdrop, there were artillery shells falling on buildings, and people were running for cover because it was the start of the Bosnian Civil War. And although this happened a long time ago, I know that with the recent events in Manchester or wherever around the world there seems to be conflict going on, that this little story of what this cellist did, of playing in the middle of the war zone, really asks us how we can bring our sense of beauty and peace to whatever might be going on around us. He sat in this square in Sarajevo and he played this beautiful piece of music on his cello, but he didn't just come this one time to share the music with others, but he came back for 22 consecutive days because he wanted to share his music and play to commemorate 22 men, women, and children that were caught in a breadline and that were killed at the start of the Civil War. Now, as my heart goes out to those in Manchester tonight and all around the world who might be in situations of conflict like this, I do hope that those of you listening haven't been in a situation like this or won't be. But it really it makes us ask ourselves, I think, or it makes me ask myself about how can we bring what we have to bring, no matter what's bombarding us on a regular basis. Whatever might be bombarding thought or trying to pull us from that sense of peace and equilibrium and stillness, is there a way that we too can bring a little bit of what we have to offer to our communities and to the world, a little bit of that deep settled calm and stillness? So that's what we'll be looking at today as we continue to talk about this idea of stillness and the healing power. And this quote that a friend shared with me a while back really speaks to the kind of stillness that we'll be talking about. At the center of the most turbulent heart, there is a place of peace, a place beyond time that cannot be touched by change or loss. No tumult can disturb the quietness. No shadow can dim the light. Here in this stillness is rest and healing. Nothing we suffer, nothing that we fear can damage its perfection. And I love this. I hope you can hear in this quote this sense that this real quiet sense of the stillness being something that's already part of us, something that we already possess, something that isn't damaged or destroyed or that doesn't disappear in moments of tough times or conflict or situations, that as we discover it deep within our heart, it's that place where the quietness exists. And it's not an empty quietness. It's not a void or an absence of activity or an absence of vitality, but it's actually the presence of this sense of peace, the presence of healing, the presence of a divine goodness that comes not from circumstances, not from individuals or from our own thinking, but really from the source being God. And that divine source for stillness and peace fills us up in those moments of quiet so that we can feel the divine presence of God. And for me in my life, that's what stillness is really about. That it's not about just getting quiet and emptying our thinking, but it's really about filling up with our connection to God, with the oneness that we share with God, and being aware of a oneness with this divine presence. And as we're aware of that sense of oneness, we can do things like this cellist did, of walking into the square, walking into the middle of what might seem a very turbulent situation, but with that sense of quietness and peace in our own hearts that's filled up with that connection to God. So for today, the question we're going to be looking at is really, how can we get there? And how do we keep that connection with God? And how do we maintain that and feel that at the heart of all of our activity so that it informs the way that we approach whatever we have to do in life? So often we think we're shaped by our circumstances, but it's really the way we approach and respond to our circumstances that shapes who we are, that allows us to be who we are. And if we can approach whatever circumstances we might be in from that place of oneness with the divine presence, then it changes the way we respond to events in our lives. Now, you should be seeing here on your screen a swan. And I share with you this image because we're going to just contrast here two different images. The first one is of the swan. And years ago, when I was thinking about stillness and peace, I used to think of an image of a swan. And I used to think about swans as these graceful, peaceful, beautiful creatures. I hope you all at home, wherever you are right now, thinking about what those qualities of a swan are for you. Just think about them for a minute and what the swan represents for you. Because that was the image that I had for a while, was this sense of a beautiful, graceful swan being like stillness. But then one day, as I was sharing this with a friend, she said to me, well, Laurie, do you know what the swan is doing underneath the surface of the water? And then she did this with her hands. And of course, as we talked about it, she said to me, the swan paddles furiously to get where she's going, even though on the surface she looks so graceful. And I realized that those are the temptations in life, to feel like often underneath the surface we're paddling furiously to accomplish things, to earn money, to make a living, to whatever it is, to keep up with others, to keep up with people in the world, to keep up with our email inboxes, to keep up with what's happening in a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed or in the news cycle. And that all of that can feel like we're paddling furiously, but really getting nowhere. And to me, the antidote really is that sense of oneness that we talked about, that we actually don't want to be like swans, that's no longer my image of what it looks like to be still. That the new image I have is more like this cello that we talked about. So if you look at the cello, the instrument, the cello instrument, so when you start to tune a cello, when you start to play, you have to tune it. And often a way to tune an instrument, a cello or a violin, is to put on a tuner, which emits a sound, a tone. And that tone is this pure and perfect tone that you then bring the cello into accord with. So for example, if you're tuning an instrument and the sound is being played by the tuner, then you start to play the same note on your instrument, on the cello. And at first, there's this vibration because it's out of tune. And it doesn't sound concordant and it doesn't quite come together in sync. But then, as you can see in the image, there's these fine tuners, these little tiny buttons that you turn. And they fine tune the instrument so that slowly the sound comes into perfect alignment with the tuning sound, the tuner, the perfect tone. And once the instrument gets in line with that perfect tone, it sounds like there's only one instrument playing. And what I love about this image is that it's like the way that we have a relationship with God, with that divine presence, that we bring our lives into alignment with God, because that's the true reality and the true nature of our existence. That by getting quiet and finding that peace and stillness, we align ourselves with the divine presence in a way that we feel the oneness with God. And then we're able to live in harmony, just like a cello plays in harmony once it's tuned. That ultimately, stillness then is an awareness of our oneness with divine love, with that divine presence. And that kind of stillness is a stillness that's filled up with the vitality and clarity and peace. And that's the kind of stillness we're looking to live with, so that it can inform whatever we might be doing in our daily lives. Now, our talk today is really based on my practice as a healing practitioner of Christian Science. So everything you're going to hear comes from that experience with Christian Science. And Christian Science is based on the Bible and another book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. You can see it on the screen there. And these two books really form the basis of the ideas and the tools to practice Christian Science. Now, we're just going to talk about those two words briefly, Christian and Science, and also God, which I've mentioned. When I think of God, I really think of that sense of divine love. Just like that the light of the sun, as it shines, that it doesn't only shine in certain places or pick and choose the way that the rays of light will shine on the world, but that the light of the sun shines universally, and it shines with impartiality, that it doesn't discriminate based on age or gender or money in the bank or experience or even any particular past life that we've had or past experiences that we've had, that past experiences in our life that we've had, that it doesn't pick and choose who to shine on, but that the rays of the sunlight shine equally on everyone. And that's what God's love is like. That it doesn't matter what religion you are or what background you come from or your economic status or your educational history, but it just depends on really that sense of love loving us and understanding the way that God is loving us. So it just is the light that shines in every single heart. And Christian Science really defines God as universal, impartial, divine love that comes to each heart equally. Now, those words Christian and Science also that define Christian Science, as we look at the word Christian for a minute, Christian is really about that sense of following Christ Jesus and looking at the Bible and what Christ Jesus did, but really specifically focusing on that idea of the Christ as the spirit that informs us of divine universal good, and that we're looking for that divine goodness in every day, and that the Christ is that voice that speaks of the goodness to us as we listen for it. And the science part is really about looking to see that Christ voice in practice in life. When we think about a science, we think about the way that a science gets its authority from experience, not from faith alone. That a science is something that applies to everyone regardless of what city you live in. It applies equally here in Boston, where I live, as it does to people in Manila in the Philippines, or in Beijing, China, or in Kinshasa, Congo. That each one of these places around the world, a science works the same in each one of those places. So for example, with stillness, as we think of stillness and healing as a science, that it says that stillness doesn't exist only when we go to the mountains, or we retreat to a beautiful lake, or we pause from the routine of everyday life and take a break and get out on vacation. But that the stillness we feel in those places, that we feel when we're on vacation or taking a break or turning off our cell phones and our tech for a while, that same stillness is present with us each day where we are. just like that science, that it's a scientific principle, that it's available in both places, that's what a scientific stillness would be like. It wouldn't make sense to say it exists one place, but then not in another. It just means that sometimes we have to pause and really look for it when we're in the middle of our daily lives. And that's where this Bible quote that you're seeing comes in for me. It's in Psalms 46, and it really talks about a directive to be still and know God, to know that I am God. The psalm itself is talking all about the way the earth is in turbulence, if you read the whole Psalms 46. And it talks about God, this divine love, that divine presence, being a very present help in trouble that we can call on at any moment when we're in the middle of whatever turbulence might be going on. And then it says just to be still and to know that goodness of God. So it's helpful for me to think about that when we're being still. I know in the past, as I've really practiced quieting and finding those quiet moments, and I've asked myself, well, what do I do in those quiet moments? Well, to me, this is really saying that we're to know God, to be curious about God, to try to understand the infinitude of love that comes from a divine source, the infinitude of the infinite nature of this divine sense of goodness that comes to every one of us. Now, another idea that helps me in thinking about this, another keynote idea for tonight for us, is from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And it just says that spirit, another name for God, or God, is heard when our senses are silent. Now, what are these senses that we're talking about? If we think of the five senses and all the ways that we use them on a daily basis, that when those senses are silent, it means that we're not watching something or multitasking or checking email as well as we're trying to have a conversation or listening to something else outside of us, but we've really quieted all of that noise to really listen for that voice of spirit. So to start off today, we're going to have 3 different sections to our talk. We're going to talk about this first idea of be still and know that I am God. The second part will be about really being still and seeking God. And then the last one is to be still and search your heart silently. And these are ideas that come all from the Psalms, the book of Psalms in the Bible. And of course, these Psalms were poems written in Bible times and songs, spiritual songs that were written. So those 3 ideas are just going to help us think about how we can find peace with ourselves, peace with others, and then peace about world events that might be going on. So to start off, let's look for a second at what it looks like to be at peace with yourself. So just think for a minute about what that means to you. And what I'm going to do in just a second is open up the chat box, and you will be able to chat in your ideas. And what I'm looking for here is for us just to share a little bit about what it looks like, what the qualities are of being at peace with yourself. So you should now have on your screen, if you look at your little bar there should be one that says chat that you can open up. So hopefully you have accessed that chat box. And and I'll just type something in it right now. Peace with ourselves. Ooh, have to spell things correctly there. Okay, so peace with ourselves is what we're looking at. And what I'd love for you to type in, if you've found your chat box on your screen, is to just type qualities that you think reflect what it looks like to really be at peace with yourself. So one person said that being at peace is to be judgment-free, which is great. Being free of judgment is an excellent quality of knowing that we're feeling at peace with ourselves. It's so tempting to judge others, to jump to a really quick conclusion when something happens. And when we know we're at peace with ourselves, we don't jump into those conclusions so easily of judgment for others. Someone else said that being at peace with ourselves is really that sense of calm. We're going to talk in a little while about a phrase, deep settled calm, that comes from Christian Science. And what I love about that is that it's a calm that is so deep within that it doesn't get ruffled on the surface by events in our lives. So we're looking for the deep settled calm that can't be shaken based on whatever might be happening to us. Someone else said to be loving. that being at peace with ourselves is to be loving. And I want to add to that sense of loving is really about loving loving with the love that God gives us. It's not so much the love that kind of is there sometimes, but not other times, that comes with a feeling, maybe a romantic love or a feeling about a particular person who did something nice for us. But this kind of love is one that is loving with the love that God gave us. And that love doesn't run out. It doesn't get in a bad mood. It doesn't become short-tempered. It's the love that we can call on when we feel like maybe our own efforts are getting spent. Another idea that someone shared is satisfied. That's a great word, right? Refreshed. A couple of people wrote satisfied. So that sense of satisfaction. Another way of thinking about that for me is about really living in the present moment. That we're not worrying about the future and what's to come. And we're not ruminating over the past and where we've been and what just happened or what happened last year or 10 years ago. That we're living in the present moment and really looking for the ways that God's goodness can be seen. And even if what happened to us in the recent days or weeks or parts of our life seems to be something very egregious, very difficult, that the satisfaction is not the satisfaction with the awful things, but it's declaring that the present moment with God, that we have what we need at this present moment, and it promises that we'll have what we need in the future. And it looks to find that satisfaction right where there would be this real pull towards feeling that there's a void or a lack. So it's sort of declaring the satisfaction, even if our feelings haven't quite caught up with it yet. Even if we're feeling a little bit that there's this void, this kind of peace with ourselves satisfaction is one that claims satisfaction even before we might feel it. And in my life, the result has been when I practice that, and it works with gratitude. Someone mentioned grateful as well, that when we practice declaring gratitude, declaring that sense of being grateful, our feelings have a tendency to sort of follow. But I think sometimes for me, if I wait for myself to feel at peace or to feel grateful or to feel satisfied, it feels very elusive. But it's that real affirming of the spiritual reality of those qualities that tends to bring them into my experience. I'll just share a couple more, and then I'm going to turn off the chat now for a second. A couple more on this particular topic. Someone said, free of condemnation. And I think that's even more specific, actually, than the one about judgment, because free of condemnation is even more specific. It just says we're not condemning ourselves, and we're not going to condemn others. I know so often the things that we get pulled into condemning others for tend to be things that we probably haven't been looking at for ourselves or need to examine for ourselves. At least that's been true in my experience. That pull to condemn someone else, to be critical, to be judgmental, often sort of masks a need in my own experience to identify some character traits that might need a little sharpening or refining or softening. And that when we're free of condemnation and we're feeling at peace, we're not interested anymore of judging and condemning others or ourselves. Someone finally also said to know what God wants us to be. And that's a great statement about seeing ourselves the way that God sees us, the way that love sees us, the way that spirit sees us, looking to see ourselves the way that that divine presence sees us. And one thing that's been really important to me about being at peace with myself is, and I'll just put up here another list that I put together, but by no means is this a conclusive list. So keep those qualities that you all just shared as well. We talked about some of them: loving and not judging, that sense of deep calm, losing interest in conflict, that when we really feel at peace, we're no longer interested in going over someone's faults over and over and over again, that we're not interested in bringing back up the drama or the conflict of our lives. We feel that satisfaction of living in that present moment. There's a sense of harmony and oneness. And then one other one that I just want to make sure we notice is this one about letting things happen rather than making them happen. So often, I think, in this world that moves very quickly and where we have long to-do lists on any given day, that we're so interested in making things happen. And a lot of times in our jobs or in our family lives, we need to take action so that things do happen. But what I have found is that being really at peace with ourselves means being willing to let things unfold rather than being the mover and shaker and trying to push it to happen, trying to make it get in there and happen, but really being willing to let things unfold in life and to see the way that they'll unfold. And that's a big sense of really being at peace with ourselves. We're going to come back to this, but I just want to ask you all now to think about another list that we're going to make here. And that's the list of peace expressed in life. And I'm going to open up the chat box again, and I'm just going to have you just chat here. Just type in any place in your life now where you feel like that you have prayed for peace before. So it can be world events, it can be home or finances or relationships, just whatever has been something in your own life where you've looked to see that peace expressed, places that you would like to see more peace in your life, or that you see the peace in your life and that you're grateful for it. So anything like that you are wanting to see these qualities expressed. So like relationships, someone mentioned, politics, someone else is putting in there to us that politics and government, a sense of government, a sense of economy. It can be personal finances economy. It could be the world economy. Another one that sometimes comes up is that sense of home. Someone wrote business or career, right? A sense of your sort of life purpose. Someone wrote in about Syria, really thinking about trying to see peace in places around the world where there might be a lot of conflict. Another one nobody's mentioned, but for those of you that are churchgoers, that sometimes church often comes up in the list, that we're really looking to see here about the way that we can find that peace in our church or our community activities. Someone else mentioned home as well. And then nobody's mentioned health yet, but that's another key one for this sense of healing, is really finding peace with our sense of health. And of course, someone also mentioned the workplace. All right, thank you all for chatting. I'm just going to switch that off for a minute, but I appreciate your thoughts and everything you've shared. So that list of relationships, politics, government, economy, business, Syria, home, workplace, all those things that you all just shared are exactly the kinds of things that we often that often are where we look for this peace to be expressed. Now, this is a list. The list on the board is again not conclusive, but just includes some of those things you mentioned. And I just want you to look for a minute at these two different lists, because they've really been important for me in thinking about the way that healing works and happens. And finding peace with ourselves is has been so key for me to really finding healing. So often, what often occurs is that we have a challenge in life, and it often is on the right side of the screen, the peace expressed in life list. The challenge might be in a relationship, with our health, with a church family member, with our busy schedules, with stress, or our career, or a sense of family, whatever it might be, whatever the challenges that specifically comes up, that we're sometimes pulled into the direction of looking at the challenge and then trying to think through a way to think about it differently, think about it more spiritually. If you're a praying person, that we bring our prayers to it. In Christian Science healing practice, we use the ideas of Christian Science to really look for healing and see the way that healing can happen. But sometimes I've even fallen into the trap of starting with the things on the right-hand side. There was one time where I was really not feeling well, and I'll just share this brief story that happened a couple of Christmases ago. I woke up and I had a very stiff neck, and it was a time in life when there was so many things going on. My children had a lot of activities going on at Christmas. I had family coming into town. I had a huge to-do list. I was supposed to make the meal and have the house ready, and I had lots of work as well. And I just was feeling that sense of my responsibilities piling up. So when I woke up and I had this very stiff neck and I was very uncomfortable, I immediately sort of was a little bit dismayed. And I kind of started with this right-hand list. I had this problem and I wanted it to be changed. I wanted there to be a resolution to the pain and the discomfort and the stiffness so that I could see the things on the left, the sense of harmony, the love, the trust, the joy, all of those qualities that we talked about on the left. So as I was doing that, and as I was sort of thinking about this, I realized I started to pray with that right-hand list. I started to pray with those ideas of, what I needed to find healing in, and to really kind of ask God to help me find the healing. So my prayer sounded a little bit like, "Dear God, I'm having this challenge. I'm not feeling very well. It's very painful. I really need to get a healing quickly of this problem. I need to have this resolved so that I can get on with all the things that I have to do." Now, I don't recommend this prayer. It actually wasn't very effective. And it was almost as if at the time, and I didn't think about this so much at the time, but it was almost as if I was having this challenge, looking at the challenge, and then contacting a faraway idea of God to come sort of intervene in my life, fix something so that I could kind of get on with doing all the things I was doing. Now, there's a couple things wrong with this scenario. First of all, it assumes a disconnection from God. It assumes that God is like this divine assistant, right, for me, that I'm the one in charge of my life. I'm doing pretty well, but every once in a while I hit a bump in the road. And that's when I call on God to kind of come in as my assistant, kind of intervene in this divine way, and then I feel better and I can move on. Well, as I found in this particular instance around Christmas, that wasn't working. So I woke up the next day and I still had as many things on my mind that I needed to be responsible for, but I wasn't feeling any relief. And by the third day, I was in so much pain between my shoulders and all the way up to my head that I couldn't even move without excruciating pains. It was very difficult to sleep at night. And I was now at the point where I had to stay in bed. I really couldn't move or do anything. So as I was lying there, I started really quieting all the senses, all the stuff that was racing around in my head. There were so many thoughts going on in my thinking, all the things I wanted to be doing and accomplishing and getting done and preparing for. And as all of that stuff slowly quieted, I started to really focus more on my prayers being about listening than about talking. And as I started to really more deeply listen from my heart for what I needed to know for this relief from pain that I was experiencing, I heard a clear idea come to me that was, I am the shepherd. And I realized that I had been even trying to be in charge of this healing. I had been trying to find the idea that would fix the healing, trying to find the idea, that quality of peace that would be applied to the problem and boom, it would fix it. But this kind of problem-solving prayer is not the scientific prayer that Christian Science offers. It doesn't problem solve something and get to a resolution. That the prayer in Christian Science, what I realized in that moment, as I was thinking about that idea of God being the shepherd, that my job was to follow the leadings of God, that what changed for me is that I started to realize I had to start on the left side of that other list, the first list that we made, all of those qualities of being at peace with ourselves, that those qualities speak about the reality of spiritual identity, of my true identity. Remember how we talked about the instrument coming in aligned with God? As it tunes into that one idea of God. That what I needed to do wasn't to problem solve, to fix something that was wrong, but I needed to see the way that I was aligned with God already. Now, that took a while, and I was in bed and really thinking about this. And what I found was I needed to start declaring the gratitude, even though it was really distracting because I kept thinking about all the things I wanted to be doing. But as I quieted those distraction thoughts, I started to be grateful for just the peace the quiet, the people in my home, this Christmas season, and all the qualities that come with it. And as I slowly started to work through the various qualities that were part of my spiritual identity, of who I was spiritually, what happened is I let go of really being the one in charge of the healing, trying to fix it, trying to problem solve it, trying to make it happen, trying to find the idea. And as I started to feel that oneness with love, the pain dissolved. And I have to say, it took me another day or so to not keep expecting the pain. Because even though the pain dissolved, I wasn't sure I trusted it yet. Because it wasn't something I had done to make it go away. That I just needed to keep relying on following the shepherd. And as I did, the pain stayed away and I was totally cured. It was totally removed from my experience. And I was able to go back down and be with my family. And I slowly, after a day or so, was able to stop expecting that there might be the pain, that it might come back. That I trusted that that oneness was that state of being, which is always there. And I just needed to really bring myself back into alignment with it, to remember who's in charge. And so my prayers kind of shifted from telling God about what I needed to have changed in my life, but really to listen, to ask God what he has in store for my life and how I can follow that divine plan. Now, an idea from the book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures that helps me with this from Christian Science's teachings is the scientific unity which exists between God and all people, God and man, all of us, that it must be wrought out in life practice. That's the science piece of it, that there's this unity of us and God, that we're in line with that divine presence, but that we work it out in our life practice. And that's what this experience was for me, about working it out in terms of letting go of me being in charge and understanding the way that God was directing and moving my life, and that I was there to be the evidence of what God was doing. That we are each the expression, the evidence, the proof of what God is doing and the way that God is acting in life. That's how we exist. All right. So peace with ourselves, really thinking about claiming those qualities for ourselves first. And then often I find that those other things in life, our finances, our home, that often those tend to kind of slowly resolve themselves, or sometimes quickly, but that the resolution comes not so much from trying to fix it, but more from really looking to see the evidence of that peace right in the middle of what seems like it might need to be fixed. Now, you see a waterfall on your screen. And here's a little analogy about this. Years ago, I was studying peace building. I was getting my master's degree, and I was working with some people in a consulting fashion around peace building work. And someone shared with me that there had been a contest for children to draw what they thought peace looked like. And here's what the winning picture looked like. The child had drawn a roaring, rushing waterfall, maybe something like the one you see on your screen. And at the bottom of the waterfall, in the pool of water, the water was churning and turbulent, and there was all this steam coming up, and it was bubbling. And can you imagine being by one of these waterfalls? Is it a very calm, quiet place? It might be beautiful, but it's not a very quiet place, and that the water is very loud and turbulent and churned up. And so that's what the child drew. But the child also drew on this ledge right behind the waterfall a little yellow canary singing. And that was what they chose to represent peace. And what I love about that is that it moves us here into our second topic about peace with other people. That whatever might be being churned up or falling or tumbling in our lives between us or others, that can we find the ability to be like that canary, to be right on the ledge behind it, but to have the ability to sing. Now, often what happens in our relationships with others is that we get quickly pulled down a current of thought. And sometimes we don't want to be pulled down that current of thought, but we find ourselves reacting even before we think about it, maybe to the way that somebody might do something or say something, whether it's someone we work with or someone we live with or someone in the news or someone in the world. And that sense of reaction happens so quickly that sometimes we don't even realize it's going on. And I think about a river. And I went whitewater rafting on a river in Colorado last summer for the first time. And when you whitewater raft, if any of you have ever been, when you're going down the river, one of the things that you're looking for are the eddies in the river. That the eddies are these places of stillness in the river. Now, there's often a rock that's rooted in the bedrock of the river, and the eddies are usually behind that rock. And if you pull your boat into the eddy, the water is still there and it doesn't pull you down with the current. And I think of that image often as what I'm looking for when I'm tempted to be reacting to someone or being pulled with the current of thought about what might be going on with someone else, whether it's gossip or drama about in someone's life, or just the kind of thoughts that are not constructive or not necessarily healing or loving. And that as we look for those eddies in thought, it allows us to make a different choice about how we think about what others do and say. Now, the way the Bible talks about this is in what Paul said many times in his letters to the Corinthians and the Thessalonians and all of his travels. And he said this, he said, "You have the mind of Christ." Now, what does that mean to you? The mind of Christ. Does it mean to you that the responses to others come from that place of stillness? Does it mean that all thought is really oriented and aligned with God's thoughts, with that divine sense of mind? Does it mean that there's that sense of oneness that we heard about a minute ago, the scientific unity? There's probably other things that you might think about when you think of the mind of Christ. But as we talked about Christ being that idea of divine goodness in life, in practice in life, having the mind of Christ means that we don't get pulled with the current, that the Christ comes in like an eddy, and it gives us a brief moment of rest and refreshment so that we don't immediately react the way we might have always reacted or continuously react. It interrupts what seems like a reaction to give us a new thing to think about. And if we're listening for that voice of goodness, then we realize that our thoughts about other people don't necessarily have to come from what other people do or say. That our thoughts about others can come from that mind of Christ, that divine idea, that divine mind that is bigger than our own thinking mind, but that source is in God. Now, you see on your screen the healing of an eye injury, and I'll just tell you the story of a friend of mine. She was working in her house about 10 years ago, and she dropped a glass, and a tiny little piece of the glass got embedded in her eyeball. It was quite painful. She couldn't get it out. It wasn't coming out with her tears or whatever. And as it got increasingly painful and she was increasingly worried about what might happen if it didn't come out, her husband was quite afraid for her. And he insisted that she go to the emergency room. Now, she had been practicing spiritual healing based on the ideas in Christian Science for many years. And she was really wanting to pray and find a resolution through that alignment, that oneness with God. But she was also pretty afraid, and she could see her husband was afraid, so she agreed to go to the emergency room at the local hospital. When she got there, the doctors looked at her and they agreed that she needed a minor surgery to remove the glass that they could see in her eye. And she asked if she could just have one moment before they got started to take to herself. So she went off and she made a phone call. And she called me on the phone and she asked if I would pray with her for healing, for resolution to this challenge. And we only had time on the phone to say one thing, which was the idea that came, which was for her to go back into the hospital and just love everyone she saw, with a real sense of that divine love, to love everyone with God's love. Well, she agreed to try this, so she went back to the hospital and she walked in and she felt this incredible sense of love for the doctors and the nurses and the administrative people and her husband and all of them. And as she did, the fear and the worry and the concern and the tension just fell away from her. And she relaxed and she just felt so loving of everyone. And as she did, the piece of glass fell out of her eye. And she walked back in and the doctors examined her and they said, "You don't need surgery after all. The glass is no longer there." And she was able to go home. But what stood out for her was that quick transformation from being full of tension and anxiety and worry and concern and fear to feeling it replaced completely by this divine sense of love. And then to have the challenge just fall away as that happened. This idea from Mary Baker Eddy's writings, the author of the Science and Health book, explained to me a little bit about what my friend was experiencing. That the heaving surf of life's troubled sea foamed itself away, in her experience, foams itself away, and underneath is a deep settled calm. You know, if you think about the ocean, on the surface there may be waves, it might be rocky, it might be rough, but as you go deeper, it's calm, it's quiet. And that's what she experienced, was that falling away of all of the troubled sea in her life and finding the deep settled calm that resulted in a resolution in her physical experience. And she was so grateful for that sense of being filled up with love. And that so much for me is the key to the quality of stillness. That it's not just about emptying ourselves of problems, that we're not praying for healing, we're not looking to find peace and stillness on vacation or in a beautiful place just to get rid of something in our life, although that's helpful. It's often a first step. But what we're really looking for is to be so filled up, so conscious of that oneness with God, that the challenges just become, they sort of fade, and they're replaced by that deep settled sense of calm. Now, there was an article in the Washington Post about a year ago written by a guy named Jeffrey Rediger. And he was talking about the scientific nature of spiritual principles. He's a medical doctor, but he's also trained in theology from Princeton. And he wrote about principles of mind and spirit that exist that we haven't even begun to scientifically map, and that we should be doing so. And he talks about how in his medical practice, he's seen cases of over 100 people who've had medical diagnoses, medical evidence for of recovery from incurable things that were incurable by medicine, but that they completely recovered from. And that in each of those experiences, he says that there are these mental and spiritual principles that are associated with those recoveries. Now, I share this with you because this was about a year ago. And he talks in his article briefly about a woman who was diagnosed with a very debilitating cancer that was incurable, and how she left the doctor's diagnosis saying, "Well, no, I don't think that's correct." And she decided to change her relationship to fear. And when she did, the result was that 5 years later, she went back and she had no trace of the cancer that had been so debilitating that they'd found. And he says this is a common experience that he's seen. And shouldn't we be studying these experiences? And this is the same question that Mary Baker Eddy was asking herself over 100 years ago in the late 1800s. She also was diagnosed with an incurable illness. The doctors didn't have any solutions for her that they could find. Her friends and family thought that she would not live very long. She was bedridden. And one day, she found herself reading the Bible, and she felt that presence of divine love, like my friend felt in that hospital, that powerful sense of there being a love that came from God that she could feel tangibly. And when she was reading about Jesus' healings at the time, and when she read that and she felt this sense of love, she got out of bed and she felt suddenly well and strong. And she said that that change in her body and her sense of strength was all through prayer, was all through just reading about that healing work that Jesus did and feeling that sense of love. She went on to ask the question, well, what just happened to me? And can it happen to other people? And shouldn't we be studying whatever the principle is here that caused my own recovery? Which is a very, it was the same kind of process of looking into healing that this man, Jeffrey Rediger, brought up last year. She discovered a sense of God as this universal love, and that there's a unity with divine presence that when we understand it more, we can see it in practice. And she found that not only did it work for her, but for all others that she prayed for and looked for that unity for. And as we think about our last section here, as we're about to close, and then I'll just take a few moments for any questions that you'd like to type into the question and answer box. And actually, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, please go ahead and start typing them, and I will be happy to answer them in a few moments. But as we think about these recoveries from incurable illness, and as we find the sense of peace and healing, that it's, for me, this is this idea that we dwell and we live and we are conscious of that sense of oneness, of really living and dwelling in sort of a sanctuary of truth. And this is what helps me so much when I think about praying for the world. Now, the tool that I use so often to pray for the world is the Christian Science Monitor. And it's a newspaper, it's an online publication, news publication today, but it also has a weekly magazine. But it is a news source with the express purpose of blessing all of humanity and injuring no one. And I find that the monitor is like step one for me in praying for the world, that it presents the news in a way that jogs my thinking to sort of ask that question that we brought up in the second section about what can I be thinking about what's going on here, rather than getting pulled with the current of thought about a particular issue. That it gives us thoughts to think that allow consciousness to be changed for ourselves and also to change the consciousness in the world. You know, I think about the way that behind all social change is really a change in thinking, a change in consciousness first. That the wall in Berlin didn't come down before consciousness shifted. That whether it's a sense of more equality or civil rights, that so many of these issues in the world happen because there's first a shift in thinking, in consciousness. And I like this idea on your screen about the sacred sanctuary of truth. That's where we hear these voices of solemn import, the voices that speak to us of how we can contribute to the progress for humanity, how we can really hear a new thought. And for me, what that looks like in practice is that when I'm listening to the news or I hear a news report, such as the report about the bombing in Manchester recently in England, that as much as your heart wrenches, as my heart wrenches, when I hear a particular news report of some kind of attack or conflict in the world, that what we're looking for, what I look for so often, is to really find that sacred sanctuary in my thinking, that kind of eddy in my thinking, to ask what the mind of Christ says about it, and to really find that sense of stillness that allows me to be like that canary, to still have a voice that offers a bit of peace and comfort in a time that might be challenging, to really look for divine goodness right where there may seem to be death and destruction and challenge. And it's not a blithe, positive thinking kind of thing for me. It's really about going deeper under that surface of turbulence to find the deep settled calm so that I find I can stay part of the solution in my thought and in my prayers. Now, there's lots more we could say about praying for the world, but I know that as we think about our prayers for the world, we can just remember that stillness is not just an absence of problems. It's not about having a world where nothing goes wrong. As much as we would like there not to be terrorist attacks, and we certainly don't want problems to be wished upon ourselves or others, but that whatever we encounter, we're looking for the presence of peace, not only an absence of challenge. That it starts for me about thinking the ways that thought originates with God, not based in what other people do or say. Now, we didn't talk a lot about this third one, but the more we have to do, the more we pray. For me, that's a statement about that the time for stillness is when we don't have the time. That the time for peace is when we feel like we don't have the time. That those are the most important times to really find that quiet in our thought. Even if we're in the middle of traffic or the middle of a busy workday, to just take a moment to quiet our thoughts. Because sometimes we hear in those moments that divine goodness that takes us in a new direction, that brings an inspiration to our work projects, or that helps us to bless a motorist on the road and not get tense or angry about something they did, or whatever it might be, that we find that staying in those moments of that sanctuary, that spiritual sanctuary, allows us to get what we have done, to get it done, but we bring with it that sense of stillness and peace. And that finally, that we see the way that stillness can characterize our daily lives by pausing throughout our day. And for me, it's really a practice of taking a moment to really pause and reconnect, realign. Just like if you picture that cello in the beginning, fine tuners, the fine tuning knobs, that being still throughout my day and quieting my thought or my inbox or my demands and just taking a pause is like fine tuning myself back into the voice of God and hearing that voice as the most prominent one in life. So go ahead and feel free to type questions if you'd like. There's at least one question here, and I'll answer that, and we'll just take a couple of minutes to answer a couple of questions, and then I'll just close with one more idea. And the question is really, how do we know the difference between the voice of God and the voice of our own desires? And this is a great question. All questions are good. This one is a particular one that I've thought quite a bit about in my life. How do we discern? How do we distinguish between those divine ideas from God versus just our own desires for things? And what I have found in my life is that the importance of this question for me has been to not get stuck in the question. That sometimes for me, I find that I used to spend quite a bit of time trying to distinguish between, well, is this God telling me, or is this really just my own will? That getting stuck there means I don't do anything. And what I finally realized is that in Philippians 3:15, I believe it is, and I'll just look it up here, but there's this little passage that says, that basically helps me move out of that place of getting kind of stuck. And it's Philippians 3:15. And it just basically says that whatever we are thinking, that if we're thinking with God and that our thoughts and our desires are aligned with God, then we'll know. But if they're not, then God will show us. God will reveal it to us. And what that did for me is it helped me to stop being so anxious about, is this my desire or God's desire? Is this divinely impelled, or is this humanly impelled? That it just made me start to realize that if our desire is to have our thoughts be aligned with God's thoughts, then the key is to take steps forward in life in the direction we think is most correct at the time, but to keep listening. And for me, that was the key, is to keep listening for that divine presence, so that I don't make a decision and then just go forward like a bull in a china shop. Like, I got the divine inspiration, now I'm going to run forward and make this decision or make this happen. But that each step of the way, there's a willingness to continue to listen. And what I find is that there are some real key elements for me about knowing God's desires for my life. And those relate to things like that they often are relaxed, that the solution is not a complicated one, it's often a simple one, that it really involves a sense of unselfishness, or compassion. That it really speaks about the little evidences of divine goodness in life. And it really aligns us with looking for that good in our life. And that there's a motivation that's really pure behind the action. So there are those touch points that helped me in making those decisions. But ultimately, I think the key is really to know that our desire is to be aligned with God and to let that move us forward, and to know that if for some reason we're mistaken and we're motivated by our own sense of will, that God will show us and will turn us around. So we have that assurance. There's one other question, and the question is about how do we know when to strive for more versus just to be satisfied with what is? And of course, we talked about stillness being that sense of satisfaction and living in that present moment. And in that moment where we're really aligned with that peace and that sense of God's presence, I think in those moments, for me at least, there's no longer a wanting. There might be a human sense of longing or a human sense of desire or a human wish for something to be clearer or to be fulfilled or to come to pass in some way. But there's also this sort of more solid sense of all my needs being met. I like the idea of thinking that we live in the kingdom of met needs, that we don't go through life trying so hard to find stillness or find peace or find healing or make ourselves good or figure everything out, and that we're doing that, so we're trying so hard that it just constantly feels like we're never getting anywhere. That all of these needs that we think we're trying to work on, that we live in the kingdom of met needs, which means that we can see the way that our needs are met today. And it's a promise for the way that our needs will be met tomorrow. And that our satisfaction is really not with material life, materialism, but that the satisfaction is in that relationship with God. And that whatever path our life takes, whatever turns and twists and it seems to go in, that one relationship with God kind of keeps us aligned and keeps us on track. And that as we follow that's where satisfaction lies, more than in a particular lifestyle, a particular place, a particular amount of money. Those things of satisfaction tend to not be so lasting, for me at least. So as we think about this idea of stillness, and that our strength is in that quietness, that confidence with God, it really brings us to this idea. And this is the final idea that I'll share with you. And if you had questions that you didn't ask tonight, that you didn't want to post for everyone to see, or if there's something that just struck you from this webinar, this lecture, this talk tonight, and you'd like to be in contact about it, please feel free to email me. My email is on the invitation you got to the webinar, and I would be happy to be in contact and continue our conversation over email at some point, or a phone call is also possible. I'm listed in the Christian Science Journal if there's a need to be in touch. But thank you for your participation today and for joining in this webinar session, for your prayers and for your spiritual activity in your own life. And I just know that sense of, as we continue to listen for the message from our own heart, that's what will really bring us forward. And I love this idea from Mary Baker Eddy that we'll just close with. It says that we should adopt the spirit of the Savior's ministry and abide in such a spiritual attitude as will draw men unto us. Mind demonstrates omnipresence and omnipotence, but mind revolves on a spiritual axis, and its power is displayed and its presence felt in eternal stillness and immovable love. Again, thank you all for joining tonight in this webinar, and I look forward to knowing that this stillness characterizes every moment of your days as you go forward. Thanks again, and lovely to be with you all.